you. And man, I thought people in Texas talked with an accent. Holy moly. Let me share my screen here. Hopefully we'll get this correct. You can see that, all right?
It's not sharing just yet. Whilst you're doing the sharing thing, just a reminder to folks, if you've got questions, please post them in Slido. The code is #NCL2020.
It's giving me an error.
Always the
Of
way.
course, first the afternoon. I may have to drop and get back on. Last time this happened to me in Zoom, this is what it did. Yeah, sharing screen share. Please try again later.
Oh.
I'll be right back.
Come back on, that's no problem. We can wax lyrical.
Be right back at you.
No worries.
Yeah, for anybody that, again, I'm going to repeat myself, but every time I do, I get like 10 DMs from Slackbot telling me people have signed up. If you haven't already, there is a Slack community available. It should be in the descriptions down below in the stream. If you're not willing to join Slack, you can just hang out on Twitter, tweet BSides Newcastle, tweet Ben, tweet Sam. Please do say block me if you want. That's absolutely fine. We do have Slido for Q&A. And we're back. We're cooking with gas.
Yeah. A perfect filler, my friend. I've got slides.
Yep, we've got slides. You'll need to unmute yourself and we'll be good to go.
Yep, there we go.
Grand.
All righty. Now we're going. Let me get the Slack page up. All right. Now you can see my screen. All right, so we're going to talk about needing a process to check your running processes. That's why we have process versus process, and their modules. The bad guys, the red teams, are coming after them. I am Michael Goff. I am a principal for NCC Group, founded there in the UK, and I'm founder of Malware Archaeology. If you're not familiar with the cheat sheets, that'd be me. And also IMF Security, the home of LogMD. So I'm a blue team defender ninja, malware archaeologist, logaholic, and the principal at NCC. I love properly configured logs because they tell us who, what, where, when, and hopefully how. That's why I created these cheat sheets, so that they came out of an effort of fighting the Chinese in the gaming industry. And once we caught them in good logging, we're like, hey, there should be a cheat sheet for this. And that's how these were born. There's now about 7 of them. And if you haven't heard about them, they're free resources. Please go check them out. They far exceed some of the CIS benchmarks and other regulatory requirements that are out there. I am also co-creator of LogMD, the log and malicious discovery tool. I've got a couple screenshots in here in regards to processes. And I am the co-host of the Incident Response podcast. So take a listen, available on your favorite consumption platform. So why this talk? Well, because these things can't tell you enough, right? Here's task list on the left, and on the right, you've got Process Explorer from sysinternals, and there's lots of data in here, but unfortunately, it doesn't tell you enough when it comes to running processes. Or if you go to the command line, which most of us should be doing, again, not enough. Because fileless and memory-only malware, right? And this is why we have to talk about this. To address this expanding threat that is becoming more and more common, too common. What used to be an occasional thing and basically reserved for APT and the WinNTI group that attacked gaming, we're now seeing in commodity malware, right? Red team engagements use it with Cobalt Strike and Metasploit, and of course, APT uses it quite heavily. And this method can avoid many, many security tools. So I'll mention one of those as we get going. So let's first rethink or redefine fileless malware. Invisible malware, right? Fileless malware. Marketing scareware. I get it. Saying fileless is an easy way to sum up a threat for management, sales, products, etc. To sum up and understand a new type of threat, right? We have fileless malware. But, as security practitioners, as blue teamers, as incident responders, I'm like, no, there's a file. Right? I can get a file on the wire, I can get a file in memory, I can get a file off disk, I can get a file anywhere in the registry, etc. But for those of us having to deal with it from an IR or forensic perspective, notice the proper spelling forensic. I'm speaking at the forensic conference, so I thought I'd throw that in here. We need more than just the word fileless. So let's take a look at another more detailed way to look at fileless malware that immediately tells us something and how to go about looking for it. Fileless malware that can only be found in the memory of a running system, malware plus memory, is Memware. Right? Instead of calling it malware, if I now say Memware after what I just talked about, you can suddenly picture yourself, I've got to focus in memory for this malware. No files can be found if you scan the disk. That's why it's fileless, while the system is running anyway. Or very short-lived, just long enough to drop it, execute it, and delete it. And this is a great technique to bypass FIM. We saw this with the Chinese APT group. When NTI, they would drop, detonate, and delete the malware, and the FIM would go, hey, we're good. I don't see anything. Typical infection vectors are injection, DLL sideloading, hijacking, process hollowing, download the source code, compile on the fly with .NET, JSC, etc. The user can even double click this type of malware, no problem at all. It doesn't really matter how it gets started. But the word fileless, right? The file lives somewhere. So let's do a better job of guiding people where to look for signs of it. So other types. So let's now categorize fileless malware in types like these. Regware, right? Malware plus the payload in the registry. This is common in Kofter, and WinNTI did this as well. So if we have malware hiding in the registry that's called with some ASEP autorun, we can call that regware. WMIware, where the malware and the payload lives in the WMI database, whether it's a PowerShell script or an actual binary living in the WMI database, let's call that WMIware. Because now you can see a pattern. If I tell you, hey, go look for some regware, you can now think, I'm going to need tools to scan the registry to look for malware in the registry. If you say WMIware, I've got to go look at WMI executions and look inside the WMI database for malware. PowerShellware. Well, this is just malware plus payload and PowerShell, wherever that may be. Pull down, detonate on the fly with Cobalt Strike, hidden in WMI database, hidden in registry, it doesn't really matter, or just commodity malware, however it gets on the box. But at least now I can focus and understand I'm going to go look at PowerShell. Compileware, malware plus payload compiled on the fly, right? The .cs files, .command line files are pulled down, CSC compiles and executes the .NET code, and now we have a course of compileware, again, only running in memory. And then downloadware, right? This could also be known as lolbassware, to give a shout out to our friends that we had on the podcast to talk about the subject, right? But this is malware plus payloads downloaded each time. And some of these infections in memory, right? Some of these process-based malwares can be a combination of downloadware, compiled on the fly, PowerShell, WMI, regware, etc. So autoruns, run, Forrest, run. Keep in mind, not all malware will have an autorun ASEP, right? There's no persistence. The latest TrickBot, for example, that attacks domain controllers through an SMB opening, again, infects into memory, runs as a process in the memory, hidden or otherwise, and nothing else on disk. No files on disk, no autoruns, no ASEPs, no nothing. So as a IR going in and looking for something, all the typical things we would look at as an analyst won't be there. So running processes is the place to focus. Especially the red teams, right? They don't like to leave IOC, so they're going to run Cobalt Strike or Metasploit or one of the other kits, and they're going to inject their code, and they're going to leave it there, and they're going to start hopping around, and they're going to try to get domain admin, and away the game plays. And of course, I have to deal with our red team all the time at NCC Group, so I kind of see some of their foo and their attempts at foo. Or the autorun is created on shutdown, then deleted on startup, right? We saw this with NTI, but also Drydex commonly did this in the past, where you typically run an autoruns tool and there's nothing there. And then as you reboot the box, if you were to go into safe mode or you had good file and registry auditing, there's a cheat sheet for that, by the way, if you want to dig into that area. as the system shut down, the malware would say, request to terminate, write to disk, write to registry. The system would start up. The auto run would be read. It would run the malware. The malware would say, go delete the registry key, go delete it off a disk. Very common Dridex technique back in the day, still used by common malwares today. So what is in memory may be all that we can see, right? The running process. So we need a process for this for sure. So latest TrickBot, like I mentioned before, here's an article from Palo Alto Networks where they found that TrickBot on the domain controller does not survive a reboot. That means what's the processes that are running and the modules that are attached to them, however they want to inject or load. That's where we need to start focusing our attention on, because this is their new MO. So how do we find this stuff? How do we go about looking for this stuff? First and foremost, everything you do should be mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. Yes, it's a colony-based solution over here at MITRE, so sorry about that, but it's really good work. If you haven't looked at MITRE ATT&CK, especially now that sub-techniques are here, you can join your sub-technique ID numbers, we'll see a couple of those in a minute, to your queries in Splunk or log management or Graylog or whatever. But the things you do and the things you look for should be mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. For example, here's T1500, compile after delivery. This is the compileware. T1055, process injection. This is where they're injecting a process of, let's say, Explorer. T1196, control panel items. This is a common Cobalt Strike control panel applet exploit, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of MITRE ATT&CK IDs. And the sub-techniques further let us break that down even further, allowing us to get more refined in our process of what we're looking for. Right, so T1574 now has hijack execution flow, now has 11 sub-techniques. And they're not always numbered, by the way, 001 through 011. It has to do with where they sit in their actual higher end techniques. But in this case, 1574.002 is where they DLL sideload, right? It's just one of them of the 11. This is what Dridex does. They put a good Microsoft binary out of System32 in an odd directory. They put the DLL that's required by that true sign Microsoft binary in the same directory. They're using that load order within Windows flaw, and they're side loading the DLL and malware into memory, and that's what they're doing here. So they're taking advantage of 1574.002. T1055 process injection, 11 sub-techniques again. Again, 1055.002 is portable execution codes, right? So this is a very portable code. This is another process injecting where they just load a binary into memory. So we need a process, and for those who don't know, I'm going to reference one of your colonies, Canada. That's Andrew Hay. That's where process came from. If you ever listened to Andrew talk, he's Canadian and he has that twang of Canadian. So he says process, and that's what kind of gave me the idea here of separating process. We're pros, we need a process to look for processes. So thank you, Andrew, for that one. He now lives here in Austin, so he's becoming a Canadian Texan, if there's such a thing. We need to create this process to start looking for this condition, whether you're using tools, whether you're using scripts. I don't really care how you do it, utilities. But this is something as we look in our infections and also, again, compromise assessments, or you're looking at threat hunting, we need to start looking at this pretty deeply, because this is a great condition that bypasses a lot of security tools, right? And some are just not preventing this technique. I work in a large house that had one of the big EDR solutions, and the red team consistently got through and bypassed the security tool, one of the big EDRs, because they were taking advantage of this technique, and the EDR did not actually monitor for this technique. We need to build this process into our hourly, daily, or weekly, and even monthly routines to detect and alert for this technique. So if you can run something that can dump the running processes and their modules, you potentially could upload those to your SIM, or create an alert within a manual alert within EDR, or however else you can come up with this email solution, however you want to be alerted, Slack, whatever. But we should start looking for this for sure to alert us on these techniques. We need to be able to process into our daily, weekly, monthly, yearly routines to threat hunt for this technique. This is a great example of something to threat hunt with, something used by not only commodity malware, but also APT. Two basic ways, right? We can do this two basic ways. Dump memory and analyze the memory dump using tools like volatility and all the plugins. Time consuming, again, kind of burdensome, kind of hard. But also we can check the running processes and their modules for signs of additional DLL or injected code. You can use a tool like LogMD Premium to scan the live system for modifications to running processes and their modules, right? So we can do it live, which is quicker. We're not altering the system. We're not having to power it down. We're not having to copy these ginormous mem files off the box. But there are two ways to address this, right? And yes, as we are doing things live, we're potentially messing with the evidence. But in IR, sometimes we have to think outside the forensics box. Finding Memware. Traditional forensics has us dumping a memory image and running tools like volatility against it. Some of these checks, API hooks, for example, can take 30, 45, 60 minutes or more to run. Just identifying the image of the box is also very time consuming, can sometimes takes hours depending how fast you are processing these images. Logs contain a ton of details that can alert you to this behavior if you collect, then detect or hunt, right? So if you are doing a good job of logging, back to the cheat sheets, remember the cheat sheets I mentioned in the beginning, and you turn this stuff on in the Windows environment, we'll talk about some next stuff here. Just kind of translate processes into daemons, but for the most part, it's the same idea. All right, the process command line, the execution of what's happening after the command's executed is the key thing to catching these attacks. How did I call the stuff to actually inject it? And sometimes not, right? Sometimes it's just a binary that will then inject code into memory. Checking running processes in their module on a live system is a great option because I can do this at scale. If I've got an SSCM or I've got a big fix, boy, if you have big fix, you get the best security tool on the planet. I can push out a check for this on all my systems, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, whatever, and I can dump all the things that are running and then run through a process that checks all those files against a master database of hashes, or master digest as we call them, and get rid of the known good items and then focus on the items that are unknown or new, and then you can go through your analysis process of that. And of course, better yet, look for signs of injection, right? The thing that's common here is you will see signs of injection where there's manipulation of memory and the code where injection will stick out by various techniques to look for them. And you can look for other artifacts like autoruns and ASAP and registry keys that are large, storing scripts or payloads in the WMI database. You know, the scripts or or payloads in the WMI database, as well as the registry, and of course odd PowerShell, large blocks, obfuscation, etc. Right? These are the ways that the stuff might get on the box and then persist later secretly. So we can definitely search and look for those as well. So signs of injection. So what does this look like? A running process shows signs of additional or replaced code. This condition is detectable by a few tools. Obviously, volatility can do it with some of their plugins, and obviously an indicator of bad, not a dead giveaway of bad. You will have to perform some analysis of these extracted files from memory through volatility. Very common, right? I do a file dump, DLL dump, and driver dump out of volatility. I then have to post-process those files to determine, and at this point the hashes are worthless to us because they're memory dumps, so they don't match the hashes on disk. And so I have to look at static analysis of that sort of stuff to determine whether those files are worth looking at before I maybe upload them to a threat intel solution like VirusTotal or Initzer or something like that, where they detonate the malware on the fly or put it in a sandbox, etc. Right, but it is an indicator of bad. And yes, some drivers will show up there too. Definitely the bloatware that's installed on servers and PCs and laptops definitely are written a lot like malware is written. It uses the same kind of things, a lot of control calls to hardware and memory and the like. So here's an example of what we execute in LogMD to look for this condition. Minus proc, again, checking running processes and modules. Minus MD, exclude the known good with the master digest, right? So I say, okay, get rid of explorer.exe because that's not what I'm looking for. I'm trying to filter out all the things that I've dumped. list processes with signs of injection. So we look for any signs of injections, hooks, etc., ads and whatnot. Then once we dump those files with a -X, we can run our B9 module against them and do a static analysis. You can do a sig check against these files. You can string out these files, something else we do with our B9 module. However you go through your normal static analysis of these extracted files or any binary, you're going to go through the same process here with extracted memory, whether it comes from volatility or whatnot. And of course, VT, you can obviously send these file hashes and or the files up to VirusTotal to see what they know about it. Often for commodity malware, it'll be known by the time you upload it. And of course, if you don't see anything, if VirusTotal's never seen it before, it better be a custom written app by you guys, or you've definitely found some good bad. So that's just an example. Here's output of our B9 module that gives us our indication. So if I did process one of these extracted processes from memory that was injected, in this case, I named it bad.exe, as you can see at the bottom. B9 will tell us it's likely suspicious. That would point the analyst to the direction to say, I need to look into this more. Here's some hashes, so you can go do your investigation on the VTs or other repos, and you can start doing your post-processing of it. So here's some examples of stuff that can be typical commodity malware we know about. Here's Cofter, right? So Cofter, again, shows hooking. Hooking is fairly normal, fairly common. A lot of tools do it. Office does it. All your browsers will do it. So it's not really a great indicator of bad. You'll get a lot of noise out of hooking. But implanting, definitely not, right? So Cofter is implanting, and we can see here that it's using the 32-bit service host. Again, some ninja tip here. If it's ever on a 64-bit system calling 32-bit programs, investigate it. It's going to be a very short list of normal. It will most likely be pointing you to the bad. But here's an example of implants using 32-bit service host. So yes, we need to investigate this box. And this happens to be Cofter. Quackbot, I actually did a malware write-up for NCC Group. We're going to be publishing that. But here's an example of 2 implants, and again, using a 32-bit Explorer, right? So Explorer.exe itself is good, but there's now injected code or implanted code, in this case, into Explorer that then can be dumped using volatility or extracted with LogMD or other tools that are out there. And then, of course, the side-loading Dridex DLL. Here's an example of where I just put it, and you can see the parent shows signs of injection. That's because it is a trusted known binary from Microsoft, run DLL32. It's signed by Microsoft, so we know, if you were to do all the analysis on that file, it's fine. But again, there's a side-loaded DLL involved here, and it would show up as malicious and suspicious, right? It's not in the catalog from Microsoft. It is unsigned, and yes, it's showing, looking at all these, they're showing it's malicious and suspicious with our B9 module and LogMD evaluation, right? So we're trying to guide the analyst to find this stuff easier. So dumping and extracting files. If you use a tool to extract or dump files from memory to disk, you can statically evaluate them like I just talked about, right? B9 can point you to the fact that it's bad, but I now have to go and look at the strings and maybe upload them to my favorite sandbox, or just detonate them in a sandbox. However, my process to do these are full reverse engineer if you so choose. But again, IR, we tend to have to do things quickly, so we need to be pointed to the suspicious as fast as possible to then go look at that in bulk. And again, look up hashes and VirusTotal, integer, wherever you want to go look at them. Evaluate the makeup of the file to determine good, suspicious, or malicious indicators, right? Is it packed? Does it have indications of weird metadata? Is there a bunch of lack of readable strings? Things that, the makeup of the file itself, a lot of things that reverse engineers look at. We do that with the B9 module. Integer does that by just literally reversing it as you detonate it. Some sandbox solutions will look at this stuff as well. You can extract the strings and, of course, go down the full reverse if needed once you extract these files. You can use a memdump or volatility to extract these files, these DLLs and drivers. Just a reminder, if you're using the Windows 2.6 version, it only works on the older versions of Win 10. You'll have to go to the NIX version to get newer versions of Windows 10. But you can do a dump, right? Volatility files, DLLs, and drivers. And then once you extract those files, you're free to then post-process them outside of volatility. Even if you run a Malfind or API hooks or whatnot plugins, you can then, once you extract those files, do whatever you want with them. You can loop them through your big API key, whatever it is that you have available to you. Pull reverse them, whatever you want. And of course, we use LogMD Premium to extract these files. That's what we use. But volatility works really well. And so here's some extracted files from LogMD and volatility, Quackbot, Covetur, and Dridex. So I named them to make it easy. But here's where their locations were, right? Here's some suspicious things we do. We look for PDBs, right? Project28.pdb, C users. So there's the actual username who wrote the malware, source repos, Project28. So sometimes these things are telling, sometimes they're not. So here's Covetur, showing you that its original file name is diffuse gravity and diffuse gravity P. Generally the internal original file name doesn't match what malware does. It's definitely in Windows more closely related to one another. So those tend to point you to the right direction. Here's Dridex, and clearly a suspicious PDB file. So again, helping the analyst focus at this dumped, in-memory malware to say, that's an interesting PDB. I'm going to go look and investigate that DLL further, right? So details of the file. You can look for simple indicators like, is it signed? Is it in the Microsoft trusted repo, right? So this is the big files that Microsoft extracts all the Windows files from. And so it has to come from the catalog if it's Microsoft provided in a patch or an OS. And then, of course, it'll be signed in many cases, though Microsoft's doing a more poor job as future versions rolled out, not signing all their code, aka like all the .NET stuff is not signed. The metadata, right? The actual file name versus internal file name that I showed you, dead indicator. You can use sysinternals tools for any of this stuff, LogMD, whatever you want to use. Is it packed? That's a big indicator. They pack it to make the code smaller. They pack it to hide the parts that can be detected in antivirus and potentially EDR from a memory string perspective. You can look up, again, hash lookups in an API like VirusTotal. It's a waste of time when you're looking up hashes of dumped files in VirusTotal because the hashes are not the actual hash. You'll have to actually upload the file, by the way. And the file will be then digested through the AV engines, and then they'll find the strings and then tell you that it's Dridex or Covetur or whatnot. But again, determining the makeup for the file being likely good, suspicious, or malicious, however you go about doing that, is the process I'm speaking of. Whatever tools, utilities you want to use, whatever output of volatility or whatnot. We'll talk more about the tools. Take a drink of my breakfast while you guys are drinking beer or whiskey over there. So let's talk about some downloadware examples. So the bad guys, or the red team, from my perspective, they're also the bad guys. To my NCC colleagues out there, you're bad, good bad, but bad. They can call out to the internet to download the code, to compile or fetch the malware so it does not live on disk, right? So examples are Cobalt Strike and Scythe. Scythe is a solution you can sign up for, subscribe to, where you can compile your own malware and all kinds of whatever you want it to do. It'll compile a version for you, and then you use it in your red team packages or test your EDR tools or your defenses with it. We worked with them on a project and created some malware. They sent us some malware. We evaluated it for them and say, here's what we saw. So it's a great testing solution, but it lets you test these kinds of conditions, or the red teams will use them against you and test you for real on the fly. Lowbins, Lowbass, RunDL32, RegServe, RegAsm, etc. You can go look at Vermo's project on GitHub, the Lowbass projects. I'll talk about the Linux one in a minute. Compilers, CSC, MSBuild, JSC, etc. Watch for those executions, right? They may write to disk on shutdown, delete on startup if they're clever, if they want to persist, if persistence is part of the game or part of the method or need for them. That's a great way to bypass a lot of tools. And so here's an example of CSC using, again, sysinternals process explorer. You can see the chain, the process tree of command, exe, launching PowerShell, always something to investigate, then launching CSC, definitely should trigger EDRs. If it doesn't, get a new EDR. And that's how you know compile on the fly is occurring. Oops. Go back to that slide. And on the right, you can see the .cs and .command line files of a funky name, but that is pretty common within compiled malware or compiled programs in general. These files generally are randomly named, so looking for that random name isn't really going to help you if you do have some normal compiling occurring, which does occur on a Windows box. But you'll see the random.js, as I indicate down on the bottom, some random command line, and then CSC no config full paths will be executed, as we can see here in the command from the Process Explorer there on the fourth line down, Windows.NET Framework, blah, 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 CSC / no config full paths, and then the path where the file actually resides, which is the temp folder over here to the right. And you can go look at Didier Stevens' PowerShell ad article on CSC. But this is an example of how compile on the fly malware works, and it can just load it right into memory, right? So we need a process to actually go hunting for that. So why running processes? Why look at running processes versus memory dumps? Well, speed, right? It's far faster and more scalable option to scan a system live for running processes and their modules. I'm in IR, right? So my job is to go find the bad guys or investigate stuff. And if I go to a box and I find a case of a bot, a piece of malware APT on a box, I now got to say, okay, I know that this network's flat, and I know that they've got 1,000 systems that potentially are accessible from this one infected host. I now have to go a one-to-many, right? I have to go now execute my foo against my good foo, my hunt foo against all these systems in order to find the bad foo that I just found on this system. And the best way I can do that is live, right? Live IR. And so that's why it's speed, it's fastable, it's more scalable. Whatever tool you have, whether it's using WinRM with something like Arthur, a Conza fork that we worked on to allow utilities to be pushed, reports to be pulled back, something Conza did not do, then that's an option for Windows scenarios where I have to SSH into all the boxes from a Linux perspective. However, I might do that in scale, right? And so yeah, you have to come up with a way to do this one to many, and that's what I mean by process. You'll have to think about this. If you have SSCM, you got a great tool for Windows only. If you have BigFix, you got a great tool for Mac, Linux, and Windows, where you can literally create a script within BigFix's module and push out a check for these conditions and pull them back. And I'm going to share some of that for the Nix environment with you here in a second. And again, dumping memory takes time. You might cause some issues on the box. There are cases in gaming, for example, when we did this, the game developers and game management says, "Hey, what the hell's going on with this?" We were doing a bunch of dumps, right? So determine the image info takes a long time. Like I spoke about earlier, I have run image infos for a couple hours in some cases, and these servers are so big now with how much memory they hold, it can be really painful to deal with those memory images if you're sucking them over, say from the pond, and I got to bring them back to here over there to the colonies. So yeah, this can be a challenge for a lot of us, right? And running all those plugins takes time. API hooks, for example, takes a long time to run. So speed. So let's talk about these evil control panel outputs. So CPL files are all those control panel outputs, right? So it's those things on the right when we open up control panel in Windows. We see that Flash player, Java, etc. So I definitely worked on one where run DLL32, whatever directory location, see Windows temp, wherever it was. They'll generally, if the red team's any good, they'll know where CPL files normally live, and then they'll push their file to that location, fake java.cpl, and then they will load it with the control or run DLL32, and boom, this will get by some well-known EDRs, and they now have persistence and a C2 channel back. And if there's no network-based IDS IPS, they're in, they own it, and the only thing that's running is what's in memory because they can delete what's on disk at this point. So it launches a bad DLL into memory, a lull bin, because they're using run DLL32 or control.exe, known good signed Microsoft binary, right? CPL files load all the time with all these control panel applets, so they are noisy. That means you normally will see them, so you will have to filter them out if you're trying to make an alert for this. So word to the wise and the warning, this will be something that requires some tuning if you go down this path, and I do recommend you go down this path, creating a process to look at CPL loads on your boxes for sure. Third-party applets are not well signed. Great, that thing I told you to look for, is this an indicator? Well, yeah, unfortunately, control panel outlets aren't always signed, so now you got to deal with that on your static analysis part. And again, many EDRs don't learn on this method, and the red team loves them. Cobalt Strike has an option to do this built into the product. Yay for the red team on that one. So for me, this is probably the number one red team attack I see because it works so well using the lull bins control and run DL32. It's hard to detect due to normal noise. Well, that's why a lot of EDRs don't alert to it. Good luck trying to create some alerts in your EDR. What I really like is the concept of how, not to promote Splunk, but how Splunk has a concept of a lookup list where I can populate the combinations, either the name of a file or the combinations of a path. And by the way, never do just the binary name. Always include the path when you're trying to exclude a file in a lookup list or exclusion list. But the lookup list concept of Splunk is nice because as I find known goods, I can put, well, it must be this location and this path and this file name and even this parent, for example. I can build these lookup lists so that every time I find a false positive, I can add it and then exclude it. And a lot of these EDR solutions don't have that kind of logic. You just have to build static, not this file path. And so there's a challenge with some of these tools of how to do a good job. That's why some of these fail in this area. So how do you catch this highly used and successful method? Well, I'm going to say back to logging, right? Logging executions of 4688 in Windows. This would not be a NIX attack, obviously. Look for CPL files and or control and or run DLL32. Also look for the parent of those lull bins. Who is executing control.exe and run DLL32, and understand who normally execute those. And that's what I mean by the combination, right? Parent-child, what's the parent? The Windows logs will tell you what that is. If you're a Sysmon fan, you definitely get that information in there. And that will help you determine whether or not there's something odd going on here, right? Baseline what is normal, create a process. The paths will be the same as normal if they're any good because they will drop the files in the same folders that generally CPL files occur. User space temp folder, see Windows temp requires admin privs, by the way, so they've already escalated privilege if they're doing that. And then also see temp right off the root, or temp folder off the root. So they'll utilize those locations, but you can also use program data. I mean, you can dump these things anywhere, right? Anywhere the user has rights to is a target for the bad guys or the red teamers, right? So %temp, %temp, %app data, and program data are all writable places to a user with no admin privs. So look out for that. And then, of course, you can static analyze these CPL files or whatever extension they may be. If you see control.exe being used and it's not called CPL, it doesn't have to be called .cpl. They're just doing that to try to hide under the normal noise and extensions that you expect. But yeah, you can look at these statically and see. So take a look at Odvar Mars project. We had him on the podcast. Listen to our old podcast about it, and you can get some details about lull bins, lull bass. Here's a full list. We also maintain one in our Malware Archaeology that points to Odvar's list so that you can get a short list of some of the admin utilities and some of these lull bins to look for. But this is definitely something you need to build in your process, is look for these odd executions or the executions of these lull bass lull bins, because they can lead to bad, and it is being more and more common with commodity malware, definitely APT and the red team. So next pro tip. See, I'm talking about Windows related stuff all the time, but now I'm getting some NIX. It is easy for NIX rootkits to hide, right? We ran into this with the struts vuln back in, I don't know what it was, 2005, a long time ago. It's easy for this stuff to hide, but there is a /proc directory in NIX, right? And if you look at the /proc directory, the /proc /1 2 3 ... 10,000 10,001 ... 20,000, right? So you got all these directories which correspond to the execution of the thing running in the process that's running. Very easy to hide. You try to do an LL. I used to work at HP, so LL would be my thing with HPUX, or an ls-l, and you don't see /proc 10,001, for example, but it's there. right? So it's really easy for these rootkits and nicks to hide stuff. If we know what is in the file in each /proc and the PID, then we know to look at the command execution line and say, well, how about I just crawl through all these folders and I dump out the execution line that's in that folder's file, and then I dump those out, and then you create a known good file of the ones you say, yep, that's normal, yep, that's normal, and then you feed that through the loop, and eventually this running process list of odd things will become much shorter, and you can quickly check for hidden processes. Because again, if I do a -ps -af whatever, again, they're going to hide the running process with the built-in Linux tools, and so that's not going to do any good. But you can compare a /proc to PS if you can do that in some way and be able to see some of these hidden items. But there's a ninja tip for querying the proc directory and finding what's running on a Nix box. Monitoring for and threat hunting. So we need to develop a process to monitor and detect for things that we want to threat hunt, right? Signs for these techniques that we talked about with MITRE ATT&CK. I would definitely say focus on MITRE ATT&CK in regards to threat hunting. Everything you threat hunt for should map to a MITRE ATT&CK item, so you can just print a big poster of the MITRE ATT&CK matrix and start highlighting the ones with purple and green and whatever colors you want to use to say that I've looked for that, and start tracking that as your methodology to threat hunting. I would say is a great ninja tip there. Enable the data. So one of the things we find often in threat hunting is there's nothing there, not because there's nothing there, but because there's nothing enabled to see that there's nothing there or that there is something there. So please enable the data. Again, reference to the cheat sheets. So the cheat sheets definitely are important across the board. This would apply to your Linux environment as well. Make sure security.log firewall-d has the accepts, not just the denies. For example, make sure Docker logging is turned on. For example, make sure MySQL logging is turned on. For example, make sure flow logs in AWS are turned on. For example, right? You must enable the data to hunt the data. Right. So if you are in the Windows and Linux arena, make sure you're collecting the process command line. This is where a lot of bad foo will be caught. This is actually how we caught the WinNTI group by the process command lines that they executed. And we see a lot of malware just launches a binary and then does all of its stuff in memory, so there is no process command line. But again, other ways to detect that, as I've discussed already. Step 2, create detections for many of these techniques. Process command line's key, of course, and its parameters will be a great way to hunt for this stuff. Right, those two items here. Step 3, come up with a process to scan running processes and their loaded modules. I gave you a technique for Nix. We've been talking about Windows quite a bit in this presentation, so that's definitely something you should come up with. Mac would be pretty similar to Linux as well. You can look at the Objective-C tools or CrowdStrike's project for their triage project for the Mac if you're looking for something on the Mac. But detect these in-memory only infections or persistence items, red team activity, whatnot. This should be used both for regular detection and for threat hunting, right? The threat hunt things you come up with should definitely feed back to your SOC alerts and your IR and all that, right? You guys are a cyclical entity, and you should be all helping one another in your detections and what you hunt for. And then watch for indications of injection. That's the big one. What's going on there? Static eval files for strings. You can evaluate files for known indicators of strings. We do this with B9. We have a module and a script that I just, I dump all the strings with B9, and then I have a list of words, and I basically look for those words, which I'll list here in a second, and then that'll kind of give me an idea of whether or not there might be some indication of a binary doing memory-related string activity or any other thing. You can use YARA as well. B9, future B9 stuff will be have YARA rule capability as well. However you want to do that to look for what's in those strings will work. And so here's an example of a string output, right? Whoops, just boof. Here's all the strings dumped out. Hello world, static, readable, whatnot. You can see at the bottom, PJ Plugger, licensed Dinkumware, all rights reserved. And so then what you do is you would then create a file, put all these known used for bad process injected related strings into a file, and then you would basically go through these string outputs and do a find and look for all these things. Again, lots of false positives. There will definitely be false positives here, but it is just one method and one process option you have, and I wanted to share with you. But that's an example of a short list. Watching for downloading of lolbins and lolbass, right? It's not so much the execution of these trusted binaries, but what happens afterwards. Any lolbass that does any kind of download or internet communications, investigate it. Thus, where the process command line will come in handy. You know, run DL32 or regserve32 space HTTP. That's how I would react, right? Alert on these. Baseline what's normal. There will not be many, but there will be some. Obviously Microsoft, but they have their own way of downloading stuff, so they shouldn't be using lolbins and lolbass for that. And then watch these executions closely for downloading to the internet for sure. Here's a short list. Thanks to Talos team for saying all the things they evaluated. Here's the short list: MSHTA, CertUtil, BitsAdmin. That's end of life. regserve32 and PowerShell are all commonly used to go phone out to the internet and phone home. So if you want to start somewhere, here's your short list. Again, Malware Archaeology maintains a list of the stuff and links to the other solutions, and this presentation has it as well. Right, process command line is key. So please map this stuff to MITRE ATT&CK and collect your process or focus on process command line, whatever OS you're using. So here's the next, the NIX lolbins or GTFO bins, list of these. Here's the URL for them. So thanks to somebody actually mapping this out. And the cool thing is it talks about the functions that these commands are used for. So there's also a NIX version of this as well. So again, alert on lolbin or in this GTFO bins in your SIM to watch for this kind of nefarious activity from the bad guys. Best options for process tools. Log management is your best friend here. I love log management. I love logs. We talked about that at the very entry. That tells you who, what, where, and why. But if not, you will need a process to manually check running processes, their modules, and signs of injection. LogMD Premium that I talked about, sysinternal tools, sysmon, if you use that, ID 8s and 10s, using WinRM with Arthur to be able to go remotely execute against your Windows environment. Of course, memory dumps and volatility for all OSs are all possible options here, many of which are free, right? And I guess log management is my best friend. So conclusion, create a process to look at running processes and their modules, modules being the DLLs, processes being the binaries. Look for signs of injection or replacement code or etc. Log the process command line execution and definitely get that into your SIM. Watch for lolbass or GTFO bin utilities. Monitor for the executions discussed in this presentation. Some tools to consider. LogMD has a free version, premium version. The stuff I talked about is not free, unfortunately for you guys, but again, it's an option. Volatility is free. Again, the HoloFind doesn't work that well. I don't think it's Win10 compatible. PECIV is an injection checker utility you can use. You can check that out. Loki has it integrated as well as LogMD does. Get injected thread from our friends over there, Jared and Manifestation, PS Reflect. Don't have a lot of luck with this. I think it needs to be updated with the current versions of Windows 10. That's always a problem. The free stuff is chasing the latest version of Windows. Of course, you can look at GUR, Recall, which is no longer, I guess, available. It got bought, sucked up by the Googs. Invitero and MemHunter, which is an older tool, requires .NET 3.5. I mentioned these because maybe people can resurrect them into a current version because they did do the job at the time that they were in use, as Recall and MemHunter once showed for us. So some resources, again, homework, Red Canary presentation, Attack Deep Dive. Look on their website. It was a recent webinar. They're doing several in this space right now as we speak. If you don't know who Devin Kerr is, he's actually brilliant. Don't tell him I said that, but I guess this is being recorded, so maybe he'll hear that. He now works with the Elk team with the Red Canary, sorry, Red Canary, wrong group, MITRE ATT&CK people. Katie went over there. Red Canary folks over there are quite bright on this, and they're doing a lot on process injection. Articles on MITRE ATT&CK sub-techniques, they're out there, so go read up on them. Deep Instinct, process injection and manipulation, go read that. Endgame, which is where Devin Kerr is, which is now owned by Elk, Elastic. Anything he does and his team does is phenomenal. He's brilliant. So take a look what they're doing. So some resources to further understand this space and what to look for and maybe where your EDRs leave off. And with that, here's the website. guys to go find some stuff. You know, there you go. And we will definitely make these available in the PDF here shortly. And you can find us here. And I am Hacker Hurricane. And because in Texas, we have to protect from hackers and, yes, hurricanes. Fortunately, the last one went to the state to our east. So no harm done here in Texas. But that's where you can find us. And I am done with